20. Rodin awoke after a troubled night, his bedding once again sweaty and rumpled. He couldn't recall the dream, but a residue of pain and fear swam through his mind. He exercised, then showered, alternating from red-hot to icy cold, relaxing his muscles while waking his mind. He stayed under the jets of water longer than the day before, though. There was a message waiting on his screen. Leopold, setting a time for the sailing session. Rodin responded, confirming that he'd be there. Leopold told him to wear something he didn't mind getting wet. He had no intention of capsizing, he stressed, but there was always a lot of spray when sailing the proper way. That got Rodin thinking of possible accidents, and he imagined the counselor sinking beneath the surface.
"You're in fine spirits this morning,"
the artist said, waving a slice of toast in the air.
"I take it you enjoyed yesterday's session?"
Rodin nodded. There was no way he could tell Sergio the real reason for his happiness. "I found it wonderfully relaxing."
"That, my friend, is because you were born to be a model. Or maybe it was the company, yes? An attractive young woman, of course, but the mystery of her past life adds a certain frisson, don't you think? Perhaps it was fortunate that you had the presence of a staid old artist like myself, or who knows what might have happened."
His smile was almost a leer, and Rodin had to force his eyes from rolling. "She's intriguing," he said. He'd play along with Sergio's matchmaking attempts, keep the artist happy. "But I'm concentrating on finding my feet in this dome at the moment. I can't afford to be distracted." And that's the truth, Rodin thought. Even if he was looking for companionship or even just sex, the contract must come first.
"Very commendable."
Sergio took a sip of his juice, pulling a face that was part pleasure, part pain.
"But work isn't everything, you know. Why do you think I spend so many evenings in the company of others?"
"I'm sure you're right. And you need their praise," Rodin thought. "But my work has to remain secret. Maybe I can take some time to myself this morning. Unless there is anything you require of me."
No. I intend to go over those sketches and make a few notes, maybe work through a few ideas. We'll eat at the normal times."
There was a questioning tone in that last sentence. "Of course I won't neglect my duties. Oh, and Counselor Leopold has arranged for me to join him on the lake this evening." Sergio grinned.
"So pleasures of the mind win out over pleasures of the flesh. Go, enjoy your time with our most interesting patron of the arts. I'm sure you'll have lots to talk about."
"I sincerely hope so. Until the air runs out of his lungs and the water rushes in. I'll be back later to prepare our lunch." With Sergio still eating, and grinning at whatever he imagined Rodin would be getting up to, Rodin put on his jacket and left the building. The sky was overcast, clouds drifting beneath the glass. They moved lazily, but according to the reports the wind would pick up over the evening, and Rodin wondered if Leopold had some sway over the meteorologists. He walked the 15 minutes to the park, greeting those he passed by as usual. Some of them commented on the slight dip in temperature, and he agreed it was getting colder, but inside he wished they'd shut up. Talking for the sake of talking. A waste of energy. When he reached the park, he recalled the one close to his old home in Jenner's district. But that, in comparison to this lush green oasis, was a patch of weeds and half-dead trees, bleak and colorless. Before him stretched green slopes, neatly trimmed lawns alternating with areas of waist-high grasses. Paths snaked through the landscape, some broad paved affairs and others pebbled tracks. To his right they reached what looked like playing fields, the turf colored with boxes and arcs, muddier patches indicating more intense game play. Ahead were trees and many of the paths led through them, although one followed close to the edge of this wooded area. This curved round, dipping as the landscape fell toward the lake to Rodin's left. It was like a small sea, the edges contoured to give bays and spits. Shapes moved about on the surface of the water, and Rodin strained his eyes to identify them as boats of various shapes and sizes. Some had sails, others were propelled by paddle, and a few moved with such speed that they must surely use engines, although no sound of motors reached Rodin's ears. People strolled along lakeside paths or lounged by the water's edge. Across the lake was a building with glass doors opened wide, people moving in and out constantly. When Rodin reached the edge of the lake, the air was a shade cooler, although that might have been the effect of the water. He crossed a bridge that arced over a river feeding into the main lake. In the water below, some brave souls were swimming, and others jumped from the bridge itself. The air was filled with shrieks and laughter. Maybe it was some kind of race or game. Rodin didn't know. He knew sports were popular in the dome, but he'd never found time for them outside. Why waste energy on something so meaningless? A group of children played on the grass, running back and forth as they chased a ball. Some adults looked on. Rodin couldn't tell if they were parents or guardians or teachers. They smiled, talking amongst themselves, and Rodin watched the youngsters, waiting for the inevitable fights to break out. He thought it would happen when two boys both reached the ball at the same time, crashing into each other, one of them falling. But the one left standing reached down, helped his fallen companion to his feet. That would never happen outside, not unless the one helping the other was getting ready to put the boot in again. And Rodin wondered what these youngsters were learning. To play nicely. How would that help when someone attacked in the street? Playing games by rules meant nothing when others would try to take what you had, including your life, with no regard for any kind of rules or fair play. But this was the dome. The worst they would encounter would be a raised voice. Pathetic. Give Rodin the honesty of the districts any day. Ahead, two women sauntered along the path, both wearing long hooded capes that Rodin vaguely remembered were in fashion at the moment. The one wearing deep green shuffled behind, her head dipped, and he considered her the younger of the two. Her companion, covered in a severe black cape, led the way as they turned toward the trees. Rodin took the opportunity to work on his trailing techniques, dropping his speed to keep his distance as he followed. As they neared the trees and moved further from the noise of the lake, Rodin caught the susurration of their conversation, although he could make out no words. The one who spoke more often, the older one, had a deeper voice, but the other's voice was almost too slight to hear at all. She uttered quick phrases, and Rodin imagined these were little more than yes and no responses. The path wound between trees, and Rodin thought back to the plan of the park he'd studied earlier. This wooded area was long but fairly narrow, with more open grassland on the far side. There was also a cafe. Sometimes in surveillance it was useful to get ahead of the target, and in this impromptu training exercise Rodin saw how he could do that. Using the cover of the trees, he cut along a smaller path. He wasn't overly concerned with the sound his shoes made on the gravel, although he was conscious of the sensation through the thin soles. The path the two females took would bring them through the trees in a couple of minutes, so Rodin increased his pace. He broke into sunlight, then turned to his right, aiming for the wooden building with the large veranda. Many of the chairs outside were occupied, the tables festooned with cups, glasses and plates. The wonderful aromas of coffee and baking called to Rodin, and he joined the queue inside, the soft ambience of many conversations almost pleasant. He eyed the cakes. Give the dome some credit, they knew how to satisfy their residents' stomachs. The only place that came close to this in the districts was Jimny's Cafe, and that was in a class of its own anyway. There'd be nobody to give Rodin information here, though. Anything he wanted to discover, he'd have to find out for himself. When he reached the end of the queue, he bought a bottle of iced tea. It was a popular choice, he noticed, and many people were sipping their drinks as they walked. There was a small table free in the middle of the veranda, and that was ideal, somewhat hidden by others, but still giving him a clear view of the tree line and the paths. The two women appeared, the one in the black cape still talking, the other walking with her head bowed, trying to make herself look as small as possible. She wasn't that large in the first place, petite was the word that came to Rodin's mind. But her cape was open, and her bare arms were not as thin as Rodin might have imagined. The clouds parted, and the sudden blast of bright sun must have warmed the woman, because she reached up and pushed the hood of her cape back. She had her hair tied back, and she brushed a few loose strands with one hand, pushing them behind an ear. Rodin recognized her in an instant. Paskia. He wondered if he should approach, maybe offer to buy her a drink. But there was the other woman to consider. That must surely be Paskia's aunt. What was her name? Shay, that was it. Her hood was far enough back for Rodin to make out her stern features now, hard mouth, sharp nose but soft skin. And there was something familiar about her. It was as they grew closer that Rodin placed her. Remove the cape and put her in a dress, add some color to her face, and he knew where he'd seen her before. The party. She was the woman Leopold had been talking to, the one who had spoken harshly to him before leaving. So Paskia's aunt had some influence over Leopold. That was worth noting. It might be something he could use in conversation tonight, maybe to distract the counselor. They approached the cafe, and Rodin started to plan what he'd do if they came in for a drink. He'd have to introduce himself, use Sergio as a topic of conversation. But he hoped he could avoid that. Talking to this Shay would only add complications to his brief stay under the glass. Paskia looked up, and for a moment Rodin thought her eyes found his. Her lips curved round words, and she looked across to her aunt as if asking a question. But Shay's face was harsh, and it didn't take much to lip-read her negative response. Paskia's head dipped as she nodded, and they walked on round the side of the cafe, disappearing from view. Rodin sat a while longer, contemplating. He didn't believe in coincidences, and the fact that Paskia's aunt was somehow involved in Leopold was troubling. But he couldn't let it concern him. If things went well tonight, Terrell would be gone by the morning.
How was your sojourn through our fine dome this morning?
Sergio asked. Once more he was eating, this time a light snack. Rodin had prepared pancakes with syrup and fruit. Very pleasant indeed. Rodin had already eaten one of the pancakes, and he'd feel bloated if he had another. Sergio was on to his fifth. And I believe I saw Paskia too. Just in passing, so we couldn't share words. Rodin saw the smile on Sergio's face and was going to protest, but let the man think what he would. She was with an older woman, and I assumed this was her aunt. Sergio nodded.
Miss Shay, yes. I believe she escorts the young woman just about everywhere, poor mite. As I understand it, our little session has been the only time dear Paskia has been out on her own.
Is her aunt harsh?
Harsh?
Sergio laughed.
She's a strong-willed woman, but I found her very amenable. Maybe she keeps her niece on a tight leash, but if she does, I'm sure it's for Paskia's own good. From what I understand, that girl has gone through more than many can ever imagine. Maybe even more than you, my friend.
Unlikely, Rodin thought. This Shay did appear domineering, I have to say. She's intriguing, though. I'd be interested to hear more about her. A familiar glint shone in Sergio's eye.
Prefer a little more maturity, yes?
He laughed.
Sorry. That's none of my business. But if you were seeking an amorous encounter, you could do far worse than Shay. She has, I was going to say, a reputation, but that always sounds sordid. No, Shay is a woman who knows what she wants and doesn't suffer fools gladly. She's been linked to many strong, fine men and a few women both here and elsewhere.
That piqued Rodin's interest. She hasn't always lived in First Dome.
You know, I'm not certain which dome she officially calls home, although I believe she currently rents rooms on Forest Avenue, so she's clearly doing well for herself. But she's one of those rare individuals who travels the trains, as they say. Oh, it's nothing nefarious, she's a journalist, something of a celebrity. She's been published in just about every major publication here, and I'm sure her writings litter the other domes too.
And she has time to take responsibility for a young woman as well. That must be tough.
But so is Shay. Or maybe she's going to use her experiences with our Miss Paskia in one of her articles. I don't read her kind of stuff, too involved in its own arguments if you ask me, but I gather she often writes about those who experience difficulties in our society. She even won an award for a whole series following those undergoing correction. I believe it was up in Ross, so maybe you even read it.
Possibly, although I haven't been in Ross for many years, said Rodin, quickly recalling Terrell's history. Her writings sound intriguing. Maybe I'll spend the rest of this afternoon perusing them. Sergio smeared another pancake with syrup, and placed a few slices of mango on it before rolling it up. He lifted it, syrup dripping, and took a bite, nodding as he swallowed.
I can't fault your commitment to self-improvement, my friend. Working your mind this afternoon and your body this morning. Whatever troubles you've been through, you set a wonderful example now.
He wiped his chin with his sleeve, Rodin made a mental note to soak that shirt later.
But tell me, what did you think of our magnificent park?
Rodin let Terrell take over, using so many superlatives that his language bordered on pastiche. But maybe he judged it just right. Sergio interjected, and the conversation drifted off into the pleasures of walking. Eventually, Sergio tired. Rodin cleared the plates away, then retired to his room and called up the dome's records. As he scanned Shay's articles, Rodin realized quite a few were familiar from the halfway house. He simply hadn't paid attention to her byline. But now he read a few of them, then read some others. He used a simple hack to dive deeper, pulling up articles that were made inaccessible to the general population. This included some files from other domes. Of course, they weren't actually from those domes. Each dome worked on a different network, and there was apparently no way to connect them. But certain documents were copied across, probably on hard drives transported by the trains, so each dome had some kind of record of the other domes. It meant that Rodin couldn't discover as much as he wanted, but he could further his knowledge a little. The award-winning series Sergio had mentioned was in the articles, and Rodin skimmed through them all. There was too much to read in detail. The articles started with interviews of those who had recently been taken aside by authority and deemed requiring of correction, and this was the kind of language authority itself used, so it was no surprise to find this mimicked in the articles. Some of the interviewees were already repentant, and most were accepting of their fate. A couple argued that they were innocent, that they had done nothing wrong. One in particular was close to violence, and Rodin felt he might have been at home in the districts. Later articles followed these interviewees as they entered the refuge, and at regular intervals throughout their correction. Some emerged transformed after Rodin checked the dates a few years, and further interviews stressed the way they'd integrated themselves back into society. Others remained in the refuge for longer, and there were no release interviews. Rodin assumed they either came out after Shay had published the series, or they were still undergoing correction. But a few were not followed up. A couple had 2, maybe 3 more interviews, and then there was nothing. And one, the borderline violent fellow, was not heard from again. Of course, someone must have heard from them. But Rodin found it telling that there were no more interviews. Either they had hidden themselves well, or been hidden by others, or Shay had been dissuaded from tracking them down. But what Rodin found most intriguing was the tone of the pieces, especially the comments Shay added. Her words themselves followed what Rodin would have expected, that correction was a means by which those who showed unsociable tendencies could be changed, making them productive members of society. But the tone was almost mocking, as if Shay found it hard to believe her own words. Pasquier, he was certain, had undergone correction. The individuals in the articles were not named, and Rodin wondered if Pasquier was one of them. Maybe, as Sergio had said, Shay saw Pasquier as a project. Rodin wasn't sure what he felt about that. But he couldn't contemplate it further now. It wasn't as if he'd need any of this information anyway. This was purely an exercise, a way of passing time. Evening was fast approaching, and so Rodin powered down his screen. He showered, and prepared to remove his target.